The second speaker is Professor Kenneth Stow, Professor Emeritus at the University of Haifa. He was a visiting professor at many important universities like Yale, Michigan, Washington, Smith College, the University of Toronto, the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He was the founder of the international journal Jewish History and was his director for almost 30 years. He's one of the leading scholars in medieval and early modern Jewish history and has written seminal studies on the attitude of the Catholic Church toward the Jews and Judaism, on Jewish life in early modern Rome, and a well-known history of medieval Jewry in Latin Europe, alienated minority, the Jews of medieval Latin Europe, published by Harvard University Press in 1992 with a revised paperback version in 1994. I will not mention all his books. He has written many really seminal works on the history of the Roman ghetto, only to mention Theater of Acculturation and Jewish Docs, an image and its interpreters, published in 2006. Professor Kenneth Stow will deliver a paper on a papal power, the Portuguese Inquisition, and a Concilium of Cardinal Pier, Paolo, Pariseo.
Well, I thank you for that wonderful introduction, Your Excellencies and other honored guests. I want to thank Dov Stuczynski because by describing the Portuguese, the new Christians, I think it serves wonderful complement for what I'm going to say now, which has to do with the papal role in the founding of the Inquisition. As you can imagine from the introduction, this is not a subject I normally work in, and I thank Dov for pushing me to finally look at something which James Nelson Novo, James, where are you? I didn't see you yet this morning. There you are. Gave me years ago, and now he's going to tell me that I misread the text. I cannot imagine anyone ever surpassing Alexander Herculano's probings into the origins of the Portuguese Inquisition. After more than a century and a half, his study remains a model of archival investigation, textual pursuit, and persuasive argumentation. As Herculano described it, it was cynicism that led to the final capitulation of Paul III, and most of all to his acquiescing to his venal court that gave the Inquisition a free hand to deal with suspect new Christians. This, as Herculano saw it, was the Renaissance papacy at its best, or should I say, its worst. Herculano was questioning the collapse of the pardon Popes Clement VII and then Paul III gave to Portuguese new Christians, a pardon which put a moratorium of 10, if not 30 years on holding these unfortunates before the Inquisition. Confiscated property was to pass, according to the pardon, to heirs, not the king or the church. The popes also sought to select and impose Italian inquisitors, not the Portuguese ones of royal choosing, in particular the Infante, the king's foremost choice. A third player in this game was the new Christians, whom Herculano insists on calling Jews, which misleads, even though the religious identities, of course, as we just saw of these people, virtually resists pinning down. In Rome, they used to call them the worst class of humans, because nobody knew what they were. Many of the new Christians had also been successful economically, which aroused old Christian enmity. New Christians needed a defense, but this is a matter I will not pursue. By contrast to Herculano, Salo Baron, more or less seconded by Yosef Yerushalmi, pointed to the humanitarianism, that's Baron's word, of the popes, who, Baron argues, did not wish to have a replica of the Spanish Inquisition set up in a second country. I myself doubt it was humanitarianism that moved the popes, But I do agree with Barone in sensing the insufficiency of Herculano's conclusions. Barone realized that there was something more, and in his inimitable way, he put his finger on it when he pointed to the objections of Celaya, the Portuguese prelate, who justified all that had gone on in Portugal since 1497 by asking how could one speak of force with respect to conversion. The Jews of Portugal, Celaya said, had not been converted by force, for there could be no coercion when so great and unique a gift as baptism was bestowed. I will not debate Celaya's theology, but the key is indeed conversionary force. For years now, I have been trying to convince my colleagues, sometimes successfully, I'm pleased to say, that the Church was a garantist institution, a term I am borrowing from Italian. I mean an institution that adheres to the law. Hence, Church policies toward Jews may properly be understood only when it is seen how they mirrored codified law. What of forced baptism? Here, too, legal development was determinate. It was also linear, as may be seen from observing judges and lawyers citing and reaffirming each other in succeeding generations and over the centuries. Rules against baptismal force go back at least to the late 6th century Gregory the Great, and even more to Visigothic Spain. In the latter, it was decided that should a person be baptized against his or her will, nonetheless, quia constat, it would become apparent from subsequent behavior whether baptism had been accepted and permanently imprinted on the soul, making Catholic behavior obligatory. This rule seems to have been especially applied in the wake of the First Crusade of 1096, with its untold number of conversions, both willing and forced. Innocent III pursued the matter further in the Bull Maiores, in which he created a formal legal distinction between conditional and absolute force. One, however, which made it almost impossible to say that the force applied was absolute, which was henceforth understood as meaning that even with a sword at the throat, the person challenged continued to refuse. That's absolute force. And even here, quia constat, subsequent behavior was determinate and decisive. A final matter was children. Until the age of reason, sometime between 7 or 12, depending on which legal authority you're reading, a child could not be baptized without parental consent, in vitis parentibus. But who is a parent? The question became a node of legal debate. For instance, as early as the 13th century, Pope Gregory XIII transferred patria potestas, parental power, to a converted grandfather. And the argument continued into the 18th century, about which, in the strict legality of its terms, both Isabel Putran, who's sitting in the back, and I have written at length, independently reaching the same conclusions. The terms of the debate were constant over the centuries, as were too the canons cited, including those of the Visigothic 7th century councils. Instructively, an idea attributable to St. Anthony of Florence and the notable Peter of Ancorano, that a person denominated a spiritual parent, that's the term they invent, most likely the person who served as baptismal grandfather, might legitimately offer, that's the term, offrire, or oblate the child to the church. But this term never gained traction. It failed to do so even into the 18th century, and even when, over the objection of many legists, the definition of parent began to be severely loosened and applied to almost any relative, even to in-laws. Recourse to spiritual parentage would have been going too far. But precisely that the idea was not accepted reinforces my argument. As tendentious as the discussion often seems, there was a law and it had to be followed. It is thus surprising that the idea of a spiritual parent surfaces in the Concilium, the legal response of the Bolognese jurist and professor of law, eventual cardinal, and president of the first meeting of Council of Trent in 1543, Pier Paolo Pariseo. It is surprising because Pariseo's text is devoted to rejecting the validity of the forced baptisms effected in Portugal in 1497 and the subsequent improper confiscation of the property of converts charged with heresy. If Pariseo accepted, as we shall see, if Pariseo accepted, as he did, the radical idea of the spiritual parent, it was, I believe, and as we shall see, his only path to consistency. It is on the basis of this concilium that I will make my case today, and I thank James Nelson Novoa for securing a copy of this text for me, which I wanted to read for years, but in the Vatican copies that I was reading, they said, no, we won't photograph it. They were very old books, and they were actually correct about that, but somehow James managed to do it, and James finally, after all these years, here it is, and please, if I'm wrong, tell me later. Pariseo's essential point is that the conversations of 1497 were precise coacti. The force was absolute and illegal. What is more, he adds, the conditions of force in Portugal are still at work, rendering the rule of quia constat, it's obvious, inexplicable. Quae quidem procedunt nisi perpetua durasset eadem causa coactione precise. This is the rule that they have gone on as though the force was still there. This is the rule that guides Pariseo as he opens the Concilium by presenting a series of questions. Was there force? Was it binding even after this long time? And how did it affect children, to whom, theoretically, the idea of continuing force might also apply, especially since the King Emmanuel of Portugal had brought the parents to convert by first corralling the children and pressing baptism upon them. However, to suggest that a second, even third generation of new Christians was not obligated to remain faithful to Catholicism was extreme. Indeed, with respect to children baptized at birth, it was untenable from any angle, and, I venture, it was for this reason that Pariseo justified the forced baptisms of children in 1497 by invoking the concept of the spiritual parent, who in the event would have been King Emmanuel himself. The concept also allowed Pariseo to deal with the violation of what he, Pariseo, along with most jurists, considered the Jews' unimpeachable right of patria potestas, formal power. By the way, patria potestas is a real legal thing. It was abolished in Italy only in 1927. It makes a huge difference in devolution of property. Those who tried to deny Jews this right by saying they are servi, Pariseo says, an idea first floated by a lawyer of the late 13th century, Guido de Baisio, do not understand that Jewish servitude really means little more than that the Jews are obedientes to their rulers. Pariseo also knew that it was skating on thin ice to allow the baptized parents to return to Judaism, certainly on a wholesale basis. Regardless, their treatment should be just. He thus opens his text with a further description, much like others that are well known, of the Lisbon massacre of 1506, so those who study that can add this one too. He is appalled, but his real reason for rehearsing the story is to reveal the motivation behind the attack, which, he says, was pure odium, the hatred of old Christians for the new. And those who harbor odium, he continues, are legally disqualified as witnesses. Good way to get at the Inquisition, obviously. Old Christians, with respect to new, were also guilty of capitales inimicitias. They were conspirators, wallowing in vilitate, and in the same vein infame, criminal. New Christians, he says, were also not potentes, powerful persons. And as the papal precedent going back to Boniface VIII at the end of the 13th century decreed, should new Christians be accused of heresy, they were to know their accusers and be able to confront them, a rule clearly observed in the breach. Clement VIII and Paul III sought to follow these same principles, which was no coincidence. But Pariseo had been drafted by the Pope to offer his legal opinion. Indeed, when Pariseo speaks of the new Christians as coacti, forced, he is echoing this term as it appears in papal letters concerning Portugal and the Inquisition, of which there are scores, all available in Simonson's notable collection. I made a list, there must be 100 of them. Other ecclesiastics too supported this view. For example, one Cardinal Lorenzo Ricci, who had suggested allowing those who had wished to return to Judaism to do so, which is unheard of. As for papal letters, not only do terms like coacti fuerunt appear more than once, they were forced, but there is the essential, especially instructive text given to the shadowy messianic figure Solomon Mocho, allowing the latter to live as a Jew, on the grounds that he was unwillingly baptized as a youth. Papal letters are also remarkably consistent in opposing an inquisition in Portugal as proposed by João III. Their reasoning is based on the same canonical principles developed over the centuries that we have just rehearsed. Not cynicism, not bribery. Nonetheless, theory is not fact, and the popes were made to pursue their opposition for years, in letters stretching from 1526 or certainly 1533 through 1548, and even afterwards, to explain which we must beware not to discount Herculano completely. We may not ignore the endless intrigue in the contemporary papal curia, and for that matter Lisbon, the back and forth papal lurches, promulgating the new Christian pardon, revoking it and promulgating it again. Something was going on in the papal court to which the popes were forced to respond. Moreover, this would not have been the first time that matters involving Jews, or those who had once been Jews, became entangled in curial politics, or issues touching the welfare of the church as a whole, not Jews alone, and shaped accordingly. Sometimes it was a matter of micropolitics. Sixtus IV issued what I consider an intentionally ambiguous document after the episode at Trent in 1475, where the accusation of murdering little Simon, Simonino, led to Prince Bishop Hinderbach's execution following a corrupt trial of all the town's Jewish males. Sixtus' envoy, Bishop de Judice, had reported the trial was a farce, but his report was too late to stop the execution. By the way, Sixtus was a Franciscan and de Judice was a Dominican, and so, all these standard pictures, we have to be careful of Franciscans and Dominicans. Besides, Hinderbach had allies in Rome, including humanists, and they're the real villains there, most notably Platina, the founder of the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, no less. There was little left for Sixtus IV, Pope della Rovere, to do, a Vatican and Roman outsider, except to state his case, and even then by hints. We must remember, he wrote, the words of the council, he really meant the canons and the bull Sicut Judaeis, that Jews are not to be harmed or punished without due legal process. That's a medieval term. In other words, you have violated this basic precept, and were my hands not tied, you'd be punished. Nor should you dare repeat your actions, the worst of which was, effectively, to usurp papal sovereignty and the Pope's plenitude of powers. Attempts to deny papal sovereignty when Jewish issues were at stake were not new. Already in the early 12th century, Emperor Henry IV challenged his personally selected anti-pope, Wibert of Ravenna, Clement III, by disregarding papal orders and allowing Jews baptized in 1096 to return to their ancient faith. A third struggle took place between Alexander III and Louis VII of France at the end of the 12th century, and eventually Louis's son Philip Augustus, over whether Jews could keep Christian servants in their home. Twice Alexander dressed the king down, which might still have been fruitless had not Philip begun to believe in the veracity of blood libels and expelled the Jews of Paris. The shoe might also be on the other foot, with the popes as the protagonists. It is, for instance, a firm papal practice to exploit matters that would seem to have nothing to do with papal supremacy to reinforce precisely that. I bring the recent example from December 2014 of Pope Francis, who fired a principal judge of the highest Vatican court for his opposition to recognizing gays, something for which the Pope was largely applauded. But Francis's underlying and I believe true goal was to make it clear that he would brook no internal opposition. Those who tried would quickly find themselves stripped of power. Francis' smile and warm demeanor belie his underlying autocratic nature, something which is well known in his native Buenos Aires, apart from supporting San Lorenzo. A like matter was that of Portugal. Clement VII and Paul III, the two popes involved in the inquisitional conflict, were avid to rein in and control the Portuguese monarchs, and the instrument they chose as their weapon was the question of forced baptism and its effects. As with Francis and homosexuality, the matter was one which the popes indeed did take seriously. Pariseo's language, writing at papal request, we recall, is unambiguous. However, underneath the matter of force was the question of power. What I believe both popes feared was not that Portugal would join Luther's rebellion in this so staunchly Catholic a country, but also in rigidly Catholic Spain. That kind of theological rebellion was unlikely. Nevertheless, Portugal was prone to imitate Spain, and the Spanish had effectively castrated papal power with their national inquisition, in which the Pope could barely interfere, if at all. To create a second monster of this kind in Portugal was out of this question. As it was, there was a third monster that already existed, which was the perfectly contemporary precedent set by Henry VIII of England, who had ordained himself not only as king by divine right, but also as the highest personage in his realm in matters that were mere ecclesiasticum, purely church, purely ecclesiastic. That is, he had placed himself above the Pope in affairs of the church, a result, of course, of Henry's need to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Following the advice given in a collection sponsored largely by Anne Boleyn, the politics are incredible, and known as the Collectiana Satis Copiosa, Henry VIII laid down the gauntlet. In February 1531, he took the title of sole protector and supreme head of the Church of England. And in 1533, he finalized his claim, which of course was in the same year in which the papal struggle with Portugal was peaking. This is no coincidence, at least as I see it. Henry's language speaks for itself, and this is archaic English. This realm of England, governed by one supreme head and king, unto whom a body politic be bounded, and owe to bear him next to God a natural and humble obedience, he being also institute and furnished by the goodness and sufferance of Almighty God with plenary, whole and entire power, preeminence, authority, prerogative, and jurisdiction. I can't think of anything else. For the papacy, such a claim was intolerable. It was far more dangerous, in fact, than that of Luther, who had decried Catholicism and the sacraments. Henry remained a Catholic at heart. The real Protestant Reformation in England took place only under Henry's son, Edward VI. Henry's challenge was thus directly to the ecclesiastical primacy of the Pope, as Clement said at least twice in strident terms, but he said it most directly to King Joao, who was warned not to usurp the rights of the Pope in the matters of religion. Was the Pope, Clement wrote, supposed to take counsel on matters spiritual from the king? Was it not to the contrary? Non decere summi pontifici in is quae religionem pertinent regum aut principium concilio regantur. I'm only reading it so you know I didn't make it up. The matter of the, I speak Latin that freely, of course. The matter of the Portuguese New Christians thus provided an apt arena for making the claim to papal supremacy stick, whether with respect to Joao or Henry VIII. The nexus between the challenge the papacy faced with both kings is patent. The unity of actors, time, and the terms in which the disputes were couched makes the case and claim airtight. Nonetheless, this nexus is easily missed, for this was not a naked power struggle carried out at high decibels. It was one pursued in the terms of the day, meaning through legal and theological debate and the traditional texts brought to bear. Thus, in 1535, the new Pope Paul III turned to two juridical giants of the day, Bolognese professors Pier Paolo Pariseo, who died in 1545, and Felipe Deccio, who died in 1536, to support the papal case. We have only Pariseo's text, or at least as far as I've been able to ascertain, but from his citation of the latter, it is clear the two thought alike. Admittedly, Herculano charges correctly that Pariseo was the representative for pay of the Portuguese New Christians in Rome. Still, Pariseo's arguments, as we have seen, rest on well-grounded tradition. They need not be judged in the context of his partisan role. The same commitment to law governed his arguments about coercive baptism, just as his sad account of the 1506 massacres was intended legally to disqualify old Christians as witnesses. Whenever you read a legal argument and you see all kinds of tears coming down, remember there's all kinds of law hidden in it. The concilia are really two, joined at the hip. The Concilium, actually. Admittedly has a utilitarian side, which does make one think of Pariseo's role as the legal representative of the new Christians, and which is present in the long exposition of the Second Concilium, setting out the reasons why it was wrong for King João to confiscate for himself the property of condemned new Christians, which, says Pariseo, must go to heirs. Yet improper confiscation was also the subject of tens of papal letters. In fighting it, Pariseo was fulfilling his commissions both to the Pope and to the new Christians. Our central attention, nevertheless, should focus on Pariseo's defense of the Pope. The Pope, he writes, citing papal predecessors and specifically Innocent III, is supreme. He is the representative of God on earth, and what he does is as though something done by God himself, and especially when the crime he may choose to forgive is purely ecclesiastic. Papal plenitude is total. The Pope may even derogate from positive law. By contrast, the king cannot annul a papal privilege. Pariseo has taken us virtually back to the bull Unum Sanctum of Boniface VIII, which of course does not seem to have been a winning strategy. Just as Boniface's claim in 1298 about papal authority failed miserably, claims that even Innocent III at the start of the 13th century hesitated to make so boldly, so it would appear would Clement VII and subsequently Paul III fail. Philip IV, the Fair of France, the King of France, had Pope Boniface arrested, and the Portuguese too were eventually granted their independent Inquisition. Yet Paul III never gave up. Even after his apparent capitulation in 1547, he continued to promote the rights of new Christians to leave Portugal. And on the subject of confiscation, too, he seems to have persisted. Once again, Herculano's cynicism seems overstated. Perhaps also we must modulate our perspective. If we take into account the challenge of Henry VIII, and even more the nature of Pariseo's response, Paul III can be said to have won, for neither the Portuguese king nor any other ruler in the great Catholic kingdoms split with Rome. Whereas Clement VII, in his Medici determination, had failed to compromise with Henry VIII, which, as some historians have ventured, Henry might have preferred, while other historians say no, with an eye on to the riches Henry reaped from closing the monasteries. With the Portuguese, Paul III had found a way out to keep them within the Roman fold. Paul III had accomplished something else too. At the same time he was fighting João III, he was engaged in inviting Portuguese merchants, read new Christians living as Jews, into Ancona, bestowing upon them, in lands under his dominion, the absolution he had mandated but failed to have implemented in Portugal. His motives included commercial ones, in competition with Venice. Still, we must recall Pariseo's discussion of continuing force, which demonstrably resonated with the thinking of Clement VII and Paul III. True coercion, Pariseo wrote, was contrary to the exercise of libero arbitrio, the consent that is baptism's sine qua non. To baptize in the absence of consent was to mock the sacrament, in which case the Pope was also fighting Luther, for without question, the baptism Paul III had in mind was that administered by a Catholic priest whose authority derived from the Pope. Canonical propriety, no less, and perhaps more than the necessities and forces of the papal curia were, pace Herculano, moving the popes. As with Clement VII's judgment of Solomon Molcho, for Paul IV, these Portuguese had, Paul III, please, had never properly been baptized, and they need not be considered heretical renegades. They were Jews, and against inviting them freely to settle in Ancona, there was no canonical impediment. Besides, these Jews might be won for the church. Conversion was not absent from Paul III's order of the day. It was he, after all, who in 1542 and 1543 established at the request of Ignatius of Loyola the House of Converts in Rome. And had not the Camaldesi, Querini, and Justiniani 3 decades before, in 1513, devoted a great deal of the reforming tract directed to Pope Leo X to ways of promoting Jewish conversion. Every letter of Paul III sent to Jews began with a wish for their conversion. So why not invite the Portuguese, and why not protect them? Because, said Paul III's true successor, Paul IV, who did not bother himself with canonical niceties about true force, the Portuguese of Ancona were apostates. This is Paul IV, 24 or 25 of whom he had burned at the stake in 1556. The days of Pier Paolo Pariseo, Felipe Deccio, and Paul III had abruptly come to an end. Thank you very much.